Today we're going to be talking about inventory segmentation and how we use inventory segmentation to improve our performance as a business. First, let's talk about what inventory segmentation is. The model that we will be using today is a 3x3 matrix. The ABC classification is a classification by usage value, and the LMH classification is a variability of demand. That creates 9 boxes for us to look at and to segment the inventory. Now, the first question is, why do we need to segment inventory? Well, demand patterns are different and values are different, so the strategies that we have to hold inventory in those based on those classifications is different. We may need to hold more of a product that we use frequently, or based on the manufacturing environment we're working in, holding less of it and replenishing it more frequently may be the better strategy. Or with a very high variability product, something that we don't use often, maybe we need to work more closely with the supplier to reduce lead times and to increase flexibility so that we're able to move that material in more quickly. Or potentially we need to talk to our customer about some of those products and say the lead time is going to be longer if you order something that not all of our customers order. So there are all kinds of different strategies that may be associated based on the inventory segmentation that we're looking at. Let's start by talking about ABC classification. Most of us are familiar with this kind of classification, but the key to understand when we're looking at inventory segmentation is that this is not on-hand inventory that we're looking at. If you've talked about ABC in inventory, a lot of times it gets used for inventory management. When we're going out and doing cycle counting, we'll use the ABC classification to go out and do cycle counting. That classification is usually done based on the inventory on hand, because the more value of inventory we have on hand, the more we want to make sure that it's accurate. It helps us to be accurate on our financial statements. But when we're looking at inventory management, we're still looking at the same kind of ABC classification, as far as 80% of the usage value being A, 15% being a B, and the last 5% being a C. But rather than looking at the on-hand value, we're looking at the usage value. Because when it comes to inventory management, we need to know how much inventory is flowing through, not only how much is sitting in the building. And so it's very important that when we do our ABC classification in inventory management, that we look at usage, not on-hand inventory. Now, some ERP systems are good at doing this, at looking at this, but they remember that the numbers in the system are only as good as the inputs. So oftentimes the ABC classification built into the system is incorrect. Z items are their own classification because they have no usage at all over the period that we've been looking at inventory. So our inventory analysis always has some kind of a time period. We may pull the data monthly for 24 months or weekly for 36 months. Then our data set is on a fixed time period. So whatever time period we choose, if we have no usage at all, then those are Z items, items that are in inventory but have not been used in the period that we are using for our analysis. Let's talk a little bit about demand variability before we go any further. Demand variability simply means how predictable the product is that we are buying. How predictable is the demand? Do we know we're going to sell some every week? Or is it something that we're not sure how many we're going to sell or if we're going to sell any? Or is it a special order that we're only going to do once and then we'll never sell it again? Or maybe there's just a huge spike in demand and we don't know when or why that's going to happen, so it's very, very difficult to predict. So that's what we mean when we're talking about demand variability. Now, that might be different if we're talking about finished goods. Finished goods demand, we're talking about the customer demand, is what's changing that variability. But in raw materials, it's our own manufacturing demand that may be increasing or decreasing that demand variability. So we have to look at the kind of inventory that we're working with and understand what the factors are that are impacting that demand. Now, when we're doing the statistical analysis associated with segmentation, we don't get into that quite yet, but it is important to keep in mind what it is we're analyzing and what kind of inventory we're talking about in order to make rational decisions around inventory segmentation. When we're talking about segmenting by variability and the low, medium, and high segments of variability, the low variability is between 0 and 1 standard deviations from the mean. Now, what does that mean? That means we look at our usage values over time. Say we have 24 months of monthly usage. So we've rolled up the usage by month and we have 24 numbers. Now, all we do is take the average of those 24 numbers, divide them by the standard deviation of the 24 numbers, and see what number we get. That's what we call a normalized standard deviation. Now, that standard deviation will help us to understand how predictable that demand is. The lower the number is, the more steady the demand is. The higher the number is, the higher the variability. So if that number is between 0 and 1, then that demand is relatively predictable in a business environment. That's something we can forecast. That's something we know we're going to be able to use. And if it's medium variability, if that number is between 1 and 2, then it's harder to predict. We may know that we're going to use it, but not know how much. I was working in a company that made milk. Their product that was kind of in that medium variability range was chocolate milk, because this was in the Netherlands and they use chocolate milk a lot to make hot cocoa in the winter. So the sales of chocolate milk was directly correlated to the weather. And the weather can be kind of that medium variability. If you track it over time, you know it's going to get cold, but you don't know how cold or for how long. And so the demand for chocolate milk was not consistent, whereas the demand for white milk was relatively steady and consistent, and they always sold the regular milk. Every week they sold a predictable amount. But the chocolate milk demand would spike when the weather got cold. So it's that kind of thing that we know we're going to sell it, but we don't know how much or exactly when. Now, the high variability product, high variability is something that we have a very difficult time predicting because it's associated with a special project, or if it's something that a customer custom orders. We just don't know when we're going to need it or how much. And that high variability product is much less predictable, and we have to work a lot harder with our customer to know when we're going to need it in order to forecast that kind of product. Now we're going to take a quick look at the inventory analysis matrix overall. We talked about the variability of demand and the ABC classification, and we're putting those two things together in order to think about what our strategies should be. Now, we could try to come up with 10 different strategies based on the classification. And many people, frankly, do that. In my opinion, that's a mistake, because in implementation, 10 strategies is too many to choose from. You need to look at the project you're working with or the product you're working with and classify it in the least reasonable number of classifications. Here we have 5. A and B, low variability. Our strategy is going to be very similar, if not the same, for those products. It might be different for the medium variability and different again for the high variability. C items, we're suggesting that we handle all of them the same regardless of what kind of demand pattern they have. And Z items, those obsoletes, are something completely different. Why would I say that 10 is too many? Because in practice, when you're working in a factory, the difference between strategy 6 and number 7 gets lost. And what you'll find is that you end up using only 4 or 5 of the strategies anyway. So why put a bunch of work into developing strategies for all 10 of these boxes when the truth is you're only going to use 5? And so you might as well set up your system and your processes to work in the way that you're actually going to manage things. I strongly recommend simplicity for implementation when it comes to inventory segmentation is the key to it actually being implemented. Any system that is too complex will never be used when it's brought out onto the factory floor. Now, our strategies around C items, I said that maybe we should handle those all the same. Well, our strategy there is to hold inventory. The C items are by definition low value. There are things that we don't use a lot, that the usage value is very low. So if we hold a little more inventory, it's not going to hurt our cash flow. When we think about inventory, it's one of the three elements of working capital, and it takes cash to hold inventory. And so when you say we're going to hold more inventory, it rings all the alarm bells for the finance folks. Well, it's not a lot of money when we're talking about C items, and the cost of holding the additional inventory is much, much smaller than the cost of running out. And so if we've got rivets and screws and tape and small items that we have that are low value, we want to make sure we have enough stock on hand that we never run out. We should never stop a production line based on a shortage in C items. We should also never expedite C items. I often see in businesses that they are expediting, bringing in a box of screws in order to make sure the production line doesn't go down. The shipping cost of expediting overnight that box of screws was higher than the value of the screws themselves. Now that is not a good use of our cash. We should have had that in stock. We should never run out of C items. And so our service levels should be extremely high on C items. In this classification, we're talking about all of them the same. We might do something a little bit differently with C lows than the rest of the C items, but these are a perfect opportunity for our vendors to manage the inventory for us, or our suppliers. Our suppliers can manage this inventory better than we can because it's their core business. These are items that we should have an area that our suppliers make sure that our inventory is kept up and they are managing it for us, so they're not drawing our attention away from the things that are core for our business. These are sometimes held in supermarkets or in some kind of, and when I say supermarkets, that's the lean term with a Kanban with a supermarket. It might be held in a supermarket. They might be held in a vending machine. There are all kinds of different tools that we can use to manage this inventory, but the key is to make it so that we don't have to touch it a lot, so that we don't have to focus on it a lot, and that we never run out. So our strategy on the C items is to make it automated as possible, and to make it consistent so that we never run out of the product. Now the Z items are a whole nother animal, because these are obsolete. They're sitting in inventory. They're tying up our cash, because anytime you see inventory sitting on a shelf, that's cash sitting on a shelf. So what are we going to do with it? Are we going to get rid of it? Are we going to use it? Can we turn it into something we can use? All of those questions need to be asked. And if there's not a systematic way of dealing with this kind of inventory, it will just continue to grow over time and eventually become a real problem for the business. There are different reasons it might be a problem. I mean, what's the problem if we've already paid for it and it's sitting on the shelf? Well, it's taking up shelf space. It has to be inventoried. There are all kinds of costs associated with holding obsolete inventory. This process of getting rid of Z items is a standard way of figuring out how to free up some cash in the business. And sometimes these items can just be, if they're finished goods, all we need to do is tell sales that we have them in the warehouse, and they can go out and find somebody to buy them. It's sometimes that simple. Other times we need to bite the bullet and go ahead and scrap this stuff and get rid of it so that it's not taking up warehouse space and not taking up our time. Now let's talk about inventory drivers. First is customer requirements. Their requirements as far as service level and on-time delivery, their requirements where price are concerned and where quality are concerned, all are going to be a primary driver of how much inventory we hold. Next, we think about our supply base. So we have our customers and our suppliers. What is their flexibility? Are they able to deliver and change based on our orders? What are their minimum order quantities? The way they set up their plant may require us to buy a certain amount of product, and it may not be the optimal amount of product for us. And what is the cost of dealing with those suppliers and of buying from them? If it's low value, we already talked about the importance of the value of inventory, A, B, and C. The other thing is the demand pattern, which we've already talked about the variability quite a lot, but there's also frequency of demand. How often is this product called for, and how critical is it? Will impact how much inventory we hold. There are products that we have to have, and so we will always use the cash to hold that inventory in order to make sure that it's available when our customer needs it. Now, all of these things are tied together by lead time. How long does it take to get the inventory? I'm sure you've heard of one-piece flow. Ideally, if we didn't have lead time, we could get each piece exactly when we need it and use it and never have to hold inventory because we have one-piece flow. Now, that's an ideal that is impossible in most circumstances. And so because of lead time, we have to hold inventory. But to the amount that we can control lead time, we can actually reduce the value of inventory that we need to hold. Here's a practical example of how to use these concepts in a real company. So here we have a data set that was from a real company where we have the A, B, C, Z classification and the low, medium, and high variability of demand classification. We can see that the low variability column adds up to only about 3,500 parts out of the 23,850. So 15% of our parts are low variability, whereas the high variability column, that's 14,000 part numbers out of the 2,300. So MRP is going to have a little bit of difficulty managing these parts because of the lack of predictability and the difficulty of forecasting accurately. The other thing that we can tell by looking at this data set is that only 6% of the parts, 1,358 parts, make up 80% of the value. That tells us that we have some very high value parts, and it's not that many we have to manage in order to manage that 80% of spend or of our usage over time. And so we can focus on that 1,300 parts and get the value, the efficiencies associated with 80% of our inventory. It also shows us that we have 2,000 parts that are obsolete out of that 2,300. And so we have over 7% of our inventory on hand is obsolete parts that we should get rid of in order to make room for things that we actually use. Now, how do we do this in practice? There are a couple of steps here to talk about when we want to think about how to do inventory segmentation. First, we have to collect the data. Now, we have to get that straight out of the systems, and it's crucial that we understand where that data comes from and that it's not already filtered for other reporting. Because if we use data that's already being used for something else, there are going to be filters applied that we don't know about and that we don't necessarily want on our data set. So make sure we get a good, clean data pull. Then we clean that. In other words, we look for outliers, we pull those out, we ask questions to make sure that we understand what the data set looks like and should look like, and get rid of things that we shouldn't be looking at. And then we validate that data, do simple things like summing it by month and validating it with finance to make sure that we're looking at the data correctly before we ever do anything else. Because the most common mistake people make with data analysis is not really understanding and cleaning their data correctly in the first place. And so all of the work that they do afterwards is then suspect because they didn't really understand their data set. Then we can go into the inventory coverage analysis, aging, the inventory profile, and segmentation. And those are in order of importance. Those should be validated all the way along with our stakeholders in order to make sure they understand what we're doing. That's it for today. If you have any questions, you can contact me. Thank you. Stay safe.